This video is sponsored by Alpha Draft, where if you'd like to play fantasy esports, where you have a salary, you pick out the players in the particular match or tournament you think are going to do well, are going to have the best frags. You try and evaluate, okay, I'm going to get good value for this player, but there's a guy who's a little bit cheaper, who's only a little bit less. You make overall the best team. You try and win prize money. People win tens of thousands of dollars every week. Hundreds of thousands, millions have been given away over the year on Alpha Draft. You can do all levels of tournament. You can do $1, $5, $10, $100. You can really go as far as you want. It's up to you how you want to play it. It's pretty fun. You can do CSGO, League of Legends, Dota 2, all the esports pretty much. All the big tournaments tend to be there, DreamHacks, ESLs. So link in the description box below if you'd like to play Alpha Draft. So Warden is a name from way back in 1.6 and before, who really came back into my kind of consciousness when I saw him as the coach of Tempo Storm recently. Tempo Storm are the team who at CEVO, the MLG run CEVO Season 7 Professional LAN Finals. Tempo Storm managed to win a map off Na'Vi in overtime on Inferno and take them quite close otherwise. And so he was the coach of this team, and previously I believe he'd been the coach of Team Liquid. And so I thought I'd make a video where I talk about who he was as a player, because before CSGO, he had quite a significant CS 1.6 career. His early career, he was actually one of the people who was a LAN failure. Back in 2003, he was playing with this team, which was like just online teams and Cal Invite. And then he got onto this team, which was, I think it was Green Berets was the team at the time, actually. And they went to CPL Summer, which at the time was the biggest money CPL that had been run. It had a crazy prize pool. And his team actually went out like immediately in the qualifier game for the bracket, basically. So they didn't even place, I think they placed like 64th or worse, maybe 65th, joint 65th to 128th. Something utterly terrible. They absolutely failed, and everyone was laughing at them. And even the team they lost to game-wise wasn't a particularly good team, as I remember. They were just like an okay, low-level, invite-level team. So then he's failed in theory. But he gets together a team which is sort of a mixture of the other failures, or other people who haven't had big success yet. He gets together this team, this Forsaken lineup, and it's a latter edition of Forsaken with different players, but it has the original Forsaken player, Funk, and it had Storm in it. But at the time, Storm wasn't known as a great player that he'd become later in Complexity. Storm was actually a player who torn up Calmaine so much that everyone reported him for cheating and said he was bullshit. But he'd gone to his first LAN, the same LAN that Warden had just gone to, and he'd failed super hard because he didn't know about the default acceleration setting on computers. And so I think what had happened was someone had installed the mouse fix to take Excel off on that PC. He didn't know it, and he'd had a terrible CPL. So people assumed he's so good online, he probably cheats, so he's just a LAN choker. So no one wanted him. So Warden got him into the team with Funk. They got Fear and Masternook, who would later go on to be in the really good rival teams of the next year. They had those guys in the lineup, and Fear at the time was a really good rising talent, but he'd only played with lower level teams, and he'd clearly shown himself to be a beast on LAN. They got this lineup together, and they went to CPL Winter, and they managed to make top 12, actually. They could have gone further. They had some really close matches. They actually, I believe, went into overtime with NOA, the team who made it second in that tournament and lost to SK. They had some really solid matches, really a good team, but it was too many individuals. It wasn't such a great actual team with a good identity. It was just good players, and many of them would go on to much better things later in their career. But this was the point in time where they got a good result under their belt on LAN, and Warden moves on. So in 2004, actually, his career's in a bad place again. A bunch of those other players have gone and formed really good teams, and he's on the outside looking in. No one wants this guy. No one thinks he's a really star player. He doesn't have exceptional aim. He doesn't have a really flashy style of play. He's just another CS player who's trying his hardest. He's got decent spray. He's got okay, like average skills for a top pro. So he actually goes on to one of the first Complexity lineups. And at the time, you have to understand, Complexity was terrible, because Complexity used to just be Jason Lake, this guy who was a lawyer in Atlanta or something, somewhere like that, and he was just putting his own money into the team. And actually, they first became famous on websites like Gotfrag, because initially, in like Calmaine or something, they were, maybe even Cal Open, they were paying Knoxville, the former NOA player, actually still NOA at the time, just even though he's not a star player of NOA, just to play the online games with them, like 130 ping or something, and just play there. So that's how people initially heard of them. Then Jason Lake started doing the same thing. He started paying other players, and now he actually bought Bullseye from 3D. When Bullseye retired from Team 3D, one of the all-time great glue guys and really well-rounded game, good role player, he retired and said he was going to go and become a cop. And Jason Lake actually bought him for, at the time, he said like a huge salary, like an insane contract he offered him. And he made him the linchpin of this call team he was going to make. The problem was the first lineup had to be really quickly put together after he got Bullseye to go to CPL Winter for 2004. And so as a result, the players they had weren't that great, really. It was Flowburst, it was Lethal, who actually later went on to do a CS Guide and work for ESEA. It was GraphX. They had just a bunch of okay players. And I believe it was GraphX off the top of my head, who at this LAN, before the CPL even started, had a fist fight with someone, got banned from the event, and so they had to use a ringer completely, and then the whole event went to shit and they placed really poorly. And at the time, everyone was laughing at them. And everyone was like, haha, but they signed Bullseye for all that money and they failed. These guys are shit. And obviously it doesn't help Warden's record that he's going back to another team and they're failing at this LAN. They placed terribly. And so everyone was even making jokes like, the winter event, because Jason Lake was bragging so much about how good he'd make his team, everyone was like, at the winter event, they're going to play 64th again. They were all making fun of him, like, haha, idiots. But for the winter event, they got Fraud. And Fraud was another rising talent, a very good player, probably the best NA AWPer, but he hadn't quite established himself as a godlike player. And this is when he became a godlike player. And they got Storm. They got in that old player that Warden had played with in Forsaken. And now they had Sunman in there. They had Trip. They got together. Sunman was after, actually. This wasn't Sunman. They got tripped. So they made the lineup basically with none of those players except Warden and Bullseye from the summer team. They go there at CPL Winter and they place 5th, which at the time was a big time result. This is a team, like I said, people were laughing at. For an NA team to even make top 6 was rare at these LANs unless you were really good. So this was their breakout LAN. And Fraud played phenomenally. Warden was a very solid player. Going into 2005, people are wondering, was that a fluke? The first big event is the Barcelona stop of CPL Europe in Spain, obviously. At this tournament, you're expecting, like, okay, who can win this tournament? NIP, maybe, the superstar NIP lineups there. Oh, maybe we could have MIBR with Element, this great ringer, Norwegian godlike player who's gone over to this really high-tempo Brazilian team who've got Kogu. Hey, maybe it could be maybe Mouse Sports. They've got one of the dream lineups. In the end, Mouse Sports win the tournament, but actually, Complexity finishes second. Warden's team gets the second. They finish ahead of this godlike NIP All-Star, probably the sickest team ever made, yet was terrible in actual games in general. They finished second, a really high-level result, and they might even have won, except it was Dust 2's Mouse Sports. That was the guy's map. At this time, though, they had a different player. They had Sunman was in the lineup, Bullseye had gone out of the lineup at this point in time, and now they had the set lineup that became the legendary lineup that Warden was a part of. So then they went to Acorn. They didn't do very well there. They go to ESWC in the summer of 2015, 2 years removed from Warden failing that CPL summer. Now he's going to the big event of the summer, and they win the event. They become world champions, and not since Team 3D had won CPL Winter 2002 has an North American team been the best team in the world and been the world champion and won a big major type tournament realistically. And they've done it. This Complexity lineup has done it. They're the best team in the world, and Warden and his team are the best in the entire world. They don't manage, amazingly, to qualify for World Cyber Games that year. It doesn't happen for them. They messed around with the roster. They took out Sunman for a while. They brought an Exodus that didn't work. They went and reverted the moves. They'd lost their 3D a couple of times. They go to CPL Winter, one of the most stacked events ever, and they actually did really underwhelmingly. It was super stacked, but they only finished 9th to 12th. These are a team who you should have thought should be top 4. Should have been able to make top 5. Maybe could have had a chance at winning if things went really well. Instead, they don't even place top 8. That was underwhelming. 2006, they have a revitalization, a revival of the team. The Transatlantic Showdown happens, which was the final of the AmeriCup. The two West American teams, 3D and Complexity, play. Complexity wins that. Then the final of the Euro Cup, the big European clan-based tournament, happens. Then the winners of the two tournaments play each other, and the second place of the two tournaments play each other. And the winner of the tournament is Complexity from the AmeriCup, and it's who was it actually over there? Yeah, let me think. I hadn't really thought that through. Who could it have been? Mouse Sports, maybe? I can't remember, actually, believe it or not. So the winner of that tournament was Complexity, though. They won that. I think it was Mouse Sports. And then they have the WEG Masters tournament. That was a big one in 2006. This had it had the biggest prize purse for first we've ever seen. It was 70,000 for first. And it was a really sick format where you played lots of best of threes. And at the time, best of threes weren't so prevalent in CS 1.6. They play that. They play out of their minds. They come second. They lose to WNV, who at the time were on this really sick little spurt of being the best team and Jungle the best player. Amazing AWPer. They go to WSVG LAN War domestically. You're thinking, right, well, they've always held it over 3D in terms of international level, but 3D have won a bunch of domestic tournaments against them. They only placed third. 3D wins the tournament, so it's kind of disappointing in that sense. See, at this point in time, Cole's cooled off a bit, and they're just a good team, a really solid team who can battle for top spots, but aren't going to be the best in the world again. ESWC, they only make it to the round of 8. They finish top 8 again, but they can't make it any further. WSVG ISC comes, basically CPL Summer, but rebranded as WSVG for 2006. And this time, Warden gets to make good on those failures at CPLs in the past by winning this CPL. They beat Alternate Attacks coming from the lower bracket, beat them twice in the final. He gets another big international title under his belt. They go to the CGI, the CGS's first invitational 4-team tournament with kind of a fucked up format, but they win that tournament. They win like $40,000 or something crazy. They go to Digital Life, which is another tournament which they'd played the year before when they'd had Exodus and they'd lost to 3D there domestically. This time they're able to beat 3D. They're able to win that, right some of those wrongs. They're on a nice little spurt here. Problem is then WCG qualifier comes. They don't qualify for WCG again. Warden never played at a WCG for the first part of his career when he was in the best teams. It was only later in his career when he's playing for one of the best NA teams, but not at the same level as Cole was, that he got to go to WCGs. So towards the end of the year, they're the big WSVG finals. First place is $50,000 and a Rolex for everyone. Cole does really underwhelmingly there. Then they go to CPL Winter. They do even more underwhelmingly than the year before. They finish like 17th place. They're in this brutal group of death that they don't get out of. 2007 comes. No more 1.6. Warden and the Complexity guys kick out, I think they kicked out, let me think, Sunman and Trip, and they brought in, let me think, who did they bring in? So they brought in Rambo. Was there another person? Let's see, Rambo, Storm, Fraud, Warden. Who would the fifth person have been? I forget that. Anyway, let me think. Who could it have been? Oh, Zet. They brought over Zet, the godlike Swedish 1.6 player, the best player of 2006. So they make what should be the all-star lineup. Problem is, CGS that they're going to compete in is in Source. Now, they actually do become, briefly, the best Source team at the time within those rules. Because in the domestic, no, not domestic, in the international individual competition, so only for CS Source, they win it. But in the big competition, it's to do with franchises, and you need your Dead or Alive players and your racing car drivers and your FIFA players to do well for your franchise to continue through the tournament. Their franchise isn't good enough, and they can't make it there. So they actually win the individual tournament. They do well. 2008 doesn't go as well. The team drafts again poorly for the franchise. 2009, beginning of 2009, Warden and those guys come back to 1.6. They join Evil Geniuses, and initially they bring in Haynes as a player, and they make this lineup. And early on, it's going terribly. They go to IEM, they place like 9th place, the big global finals. They go to a USA qualifier for Code 5, and they don't even place top 4. They're not even top 4 domestically. But they get invited to the ESWC in Korea, in Cheonan, and they get Lurpis. And Lurpis comes in from Europe, a Finnish player, to be the in-game leader of this team living in America. So Warden's now in a completely unique setup he's never seen, but with this European in-game leader, and immediately things start to get going. They only finished 9th to 16 at EFWC because they did have to play, I think, SK in the first round, so bad draw there. Let me think what happened then. They play a couple of ESCA domestic titles, the Season 2 and Season 3. They win those, so they get on top in domestically at least, so now they're building the foundation for more success. They go to Game Goon Mexico, where they play the Koreans of Project KR and some other domestic teams. Top team, I think it was Turmoil was the best other team there at the time. They beat those and they win that tournament. They go to IEM Chengdu, which was the stop in China. They place 5th to 8th, but they play SK, who ends up winning the tournament, and they take them close on one map. And overall, you can see they're improving internationally. They're becoming a top team. And Warden's again within one of the top 5 to 6 teams in the world. They're getting to that place at least. At this point, they're still hinting at it, but they're going to get there. So, amazingly, they actually bomb an ESEA season. They only finished 3rd once. They got absolutely shocked. I think it was Dink or someone, this team that was like Paulie and those guys, and they just randomly upset them on LAN. But they go to WCG. Finally, Warden's at a WCG. And at the WCG, they can't use Lurpis because he's Finnish. And it's a nationalistic tournament. You have to have people from the same country. So they have to bring in, I think it was, let me think, who did they actually bring in at the time? I think at the time what they did was they brought in Good for Nothing, who was going to replace Warden. I think I'm right on this. And he just played in the team with Warden, and this was going to be the last big event for Warden. So there's a couple more events actually. Let me think. So I think that was his last big. Was it that event or DreamHack Winter was his last big event? I'm not quite certain. I think it was WCG was his last big event. At that point, as a player, he steps back. Now, EG as a team, at that point, actually went on to more success. They had a bunch of like top 3, top 4s in big finishes, even what beat the legendary Fnatic at MSR beat in 2010, became a legit top 4, top 5 team. He didn't really get to experience that because that was the Good for Nothing era, and we all know that was nothing a fraud with the stars of that team. But you go forwards, and you come to later on, and actually, he still plays a bit of 1.6 towards the end. Like in 2011, there was IEM New York, and he was on a Czech 16, which was him, Fraud, and Storm. And interestingly, a player called Hiko. At the time, not a very well-known player, just an invite-level player, not a star player in any sense, but he's playing with them at that point in time. They finished 5th to 8th there. They don't get out of the groups. They couldn't really have done so. 2012, now we're moving to the period where he plays in another Czech 6 team. This time it's Storm XP3, the old French guy from 1.6, but who's been playing in North America for a while. Warden, Fraud, people who'd all play later in CSGO together, and Dizzaman, the guy who'd been in the previous X6 with. They finished 3rd in the 1.6 tournament, pretty much almost the last 1.6 tournament they had. 2013, he's playing some CSGO. He makes like a top 8 at one of the SEAs, not that great. 2014, they do an ESEA season 15, the one that, if you remember famously, I think that was the one that was won by... Yeah, that was the first one iBuyPower won over Titan, if you remember, at the beginning of 2013. 14, rather. That was the one where his cultivation team, which was most of the same players, Storm, Warden, Dizzaman, Fraud, and a different guy, they were able to finish, let me think. No, a cultivation was in that era. That wasn't the team he played for. The team he played for was actually U5. That's right, United 5, an old 1.6 name. They finished 4th at that LAN, because admittedly it was mainly just domestic competition then. They weren't that good. That was, though, Moses, now an analyst, Storm, XP3, I can't remember who they were, someone like, it's called like TM or something. I forget who that guy was. But no Fraud in this one, I think. Then they were at the now infamous Iron Gaming tournament where Nip and Navi played. It was a joke and there was no mouse space. They played there, made top 4. ESEA 17 was the one where... Let me think. Who won ESEA season 17? That was the one that was won by Fnatic from the lower bracket of Virtus Pro at the end of 2014. And he was on Elevate at the time. And this is where you see the core of Elevate, which obviously has even played into 2015, of XP3, Storm, same sorts of players. This one had Rush, though, who went on to the later Elevate teams. And it had Volcano, who was an old rival of Warden's for when he was in 3D earlier on the day. And Zex before that, but mainly 3D. And then had been... the guy who goes on later to design Cash, the version we have for CSGO, and works now, I think, for Valve or something crazy like that. In 2015, though, he becomes a coach. He's a coach for TL for the first few months, so maybe the less said about that, the better, because TL's was fucking terrible for the first few months. Absolute dog shit team. Then he was the coach of Tempo Storm, who, as I said, had that good result there. Now, as a player, as a 1.6 player, the key thing to make the case about with Warden is to say at this outset, he had okay aim. He was a player who sprayed all the time. His problem was, I think he sprayed a bit too much. He's the guy where if you were coming at him and he was medium range, he just crouched and sprayed all in a circle and you would hope he killed you. And he didn't have super sick Heaton-esque spray. He just had okay spray. And so he'd get some kills, but not uber reliably at the peak level. Now, sometimes, towards the end of his 1.6 time, when he was in the first sprint before going to CGS The Source in 2007, in late 2006, he'd actually honed some technique. His tapping and slight bit of bursting, mainly tapping. He was one of the players who really took over tapping and really started doing it a lot. Just tapping at 3 or 4 bullets into the chest, and you would ensure you got the kill and you could lock a guy down. He was making really good use of that, and that allowed him to become more of a clutch player, actually, because he was now staying within his limits, but he had some technique. And that made him, around that time, 2006, that was when he became quite a clutch player. He could win 1v3s, he would have a level head, he wouldn't try to be too cocky and out-duel him in a name, he'd just take the right situations, the right positions, and win some clutch rounds. He was a great team player. He's a guy who really understood what his team needed and how to facilitate stars, like Fraud was the uber star. Storm was pretty much a star as well. He knew how to work around them, but then to be the connecting point in terms of skill and role between the role players of Trip and Sunman, Sunman was the clutch player, Trip was the in-game leader who did the basics. He was the guy connecting this unit together to make it work. He was a great confidence player. He's a guy who would pump up his team, who would make sure they were all on a positive attitude, keep them in the game mentally, and that's why they were able to do all these famous comebacks and great play. And he's a very loyal guy as well, wanting to play with the same teammates over and over, who understood that you can't let stars just get out of control and dictate everything. He also, interestingly, had a brother, nicknamed Mason, who played earlier in the day, played for a later Forsaken team, but never got to the same level. But they were brothers within the scene, both playing at an invite level. So an interesting player, actually. Very much a journeyman, not in any way a star player. A journeyman who understood his limits, developed his skill set, and played his role within some of the greatest North American teams of all time. Particularly Complexity, probably the greatest NA team of all time in 1.6, who were world champions once, if not a couple of times, in terms of big tournaments they won internationally. So a great player. Thanks to Offer Draft for sponsoring this podcast.